Encourage people to remember Graham and Dawn. I visited them this week, and they're doing well, but they wouldn't mind a visit sometimes from some of the church members just to say hello and to remember them. But in their capacity, that's happened. They're getting a bit older, and I said to them, what are you doing? And they said, we're looking forward to the Lord's return. They're waiting for that trumpet call. And when I said that, Graham's hands just went up. He says, now. He wants to go now, but he has to wait. As we turn in our Bibles to Zechariah chapter 9, and we finish this, we're going to look, are you ready? And I wonder today too, whether Israel's ready for the prophetic program of God, particularly as what's taken place this week. Who would have thought that what we witnessed in our world would happen as it's happened? And people are wondering, what does all this mean? And I wonder whether our world is really ready. Are they ready for the coming of the Lord? And as we sit here, and most, I would say here, are believers, are you ready for the Lord's return? As Matthew has already indicated, the Bible indicates, we don't know the date, we don't know the time, we just know it's going to happen. But when? And there are many people who mock and make fun of the second coming of the Lord because they don't understand that God has a purpose and a plan for Israel and for the church. Now, let me say this. The church is not Israel, and God has not abandoned Israel. And there's often confusion between the teaching of the two. There are people who mock the 1,000 year of reign. They reject the rapture. Many believe the church is the Israel of God. Many believe that they'll go through the great tribulation and face God's wrath as a means of cleansing the church. All of this fails to consider just what Jesus has done on the cross of Calvary, because we're told very clearly his blood cleanses all our sin, past, present, and future. The church doesn't have to go through a cleansing. But as Christians, are we waiting? Are we expecting the return of the Lord at any time? And while we wait, what are we doing? What are we doing? Are we living lives that indeed will please him? As I've said, we don't have a date. We don't have a time of his return. But we know that when he comes, will we be found faithful when he does? Many people are waiting for a Messiah, but it's not the God of the Bible. It's not the person of Jesus Christ. It's a world ruler of their own choosing. And we're told from Scripture that how this person will rise to power and rule the world. But this world is not prepared for Jesus Christ when he does come and set up his kingdom on earth. Now, Zechariah is presenting a truth about the Lord's coming, an order that his people can prepare for their king. But I wonder today, as a Christian, are you ready? Are you waiting for the trumpet call? When it's blown, will you be happy? Are you sure you would go up to be with the Lord? Are you a believer, or are you one of those who mock and say, oh, I've been hearing all this stuff for years and nothing changes? In the world in which we live, change happens very quickly, and it affects our whole world. And we need to be aware, and particularly about what the Bible says. God has not left this world to its own devices, nor the people that live within it. There is a day of accountability coming, and it'll be sooner rather than later. But let's turn our Bibles. The first thing I want us to do is to look at the powerful response. In these verses between verses 13 and 15, it's the time period between the last of the Old Testament books and the appearance of Jesus Christ. And it's usually called the intertestamental period. It was from the prophet Malachi's time, about 400 BC, to the preaching of John the Baptist in AD 25. And during this time, God did not utter any prophetic word between Malachi and John. And often it's called the 400 silent years, where God did not speak through his prophets. The political, religious and social atmosphere of Israel during those 400 years changed significantly. Much of what was happened, though, was predicted by the prophet Daniel. And you'll see if I put this up, that just gives you an idea of this intertestamental period that's spoken about in Daniel chapter 11. Now, Israel at the time had been under the control of the Persian Empire, and in that time the Persians allowed the Jewish people to practice their religion and didn't interfere much in what they did. They were allowed to rebuild and worship the temple. And this span of time included the last 100 years of the Old Testament period and the first 100 years of this new period. It was a time of relative peace and contentment before things began to change. Prior to this period, Alexander the Great defeated Darius of Persia, bringing a Greek rule to the world. And so when Alexander conquered the world, he required that the Greek culture be promoted in every land that he conquered. So it didn't matter where you lived, you had to learn to speak Greek. You had to learn to trade. You had to learn the Greek culture. And that happened throughout the known world because Alexander conquered the known world. So many people had to learn Greek. He didn't allow freedom for the Jews, although he strongly promoted the Greek lifestyles. So this was not a good turn of events for Israel, since the Greek culture was very worldly, very humanistic, very ungodly. But after Alexander died, Judea was ruled by a number of successors, culminating in a person called King Antiochus Epiphanes. That's a wonderful word. Antiochus Epiphanes. Have you heard that name before? If you've done history, you will. If you look at prophecy, you will. That name will be familiar. And he wasn't a nice ruler. He, first of all, stopped a lot of the religious freedoms. He got rid of the priesthood, and he desecrated the temple. He defiled it with unclean animals and used a pagan altar. Now, you can imagine if you were a Jewish person, you're used to worshipping the temple, and the temple had to have certain requirements before you could worship. And this fellow Antiochus Epiphanes had come in and desecrated the temple. It's going to cause a response. And it did. And in those days, there was a man called Judas Maccabeus, and he took on Antiochus, and there was a battle, and for a short time, they were able to overcome Antiochus and restore the temple and rescue the temple. It's often referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. It was a war, it was violent, and there was a lot of infighting. We then know that Pompey came and conquered Israel, putting all of Judea under the control of the Romans. They made Herod a puppet king of Judea. This is a nation that taxed and controlled the Jewish people and eventually executed Jesus on that cross. So what we have now in this 400 years is a period of Roman, Greek, and Hebrew cultures all mixed together in this setting in Judea.
Didn't Pompeii get destroyed volcano?
No,
What's that?
Pompeii, it's a person, not the city.
Yeah.
All right? We also find that during this time we have religious orders. We have the Pharisees and we have the Sadducees, and they became dictators in their own particular way. But in this period, it set the stage, the 400 years, for the arrival of Jesus Christ and the impact that it would have on the Jewish people. And at that particular time, because of the turmoil, both Jewish people and non-Jewish people were dissatisfied with the religion and what it offered. And pagans were beginning to question the validity of having so many gods. Now, in Roman Greek mythology, they have a god for everything. There's a god everywhere that you go. And many of the Greeks and the Romans, they worship these gods, and they were dissatisfied. And so they withdrew to understanding a little bit more about this Hebrew God that was being promoted. The Jews, however, were despondent, they were oppressed, and hope was running low. They were convinced that there was only one thing would save them, and that what they were looking for is the arrival of their promised Messiah. They were looking for him to conquer the Romans, to take over, set up his kingdom and rule them. That's what they were looking for at that particular time. Now, where was God in all of this? What was he doing? Did he have a day off? Was he on annual leave? Maybe he was on long service leave. What was God doing in these 400 years? People say it was a silent years, but it didn't mean that God wasn't doing anything. He was moving and using the events of that time. The Romans built roads. Yeah, what are roads good for? Freedom to move about. And they built some good roads. But it was an opportunity to take the gospel elsewhere. And they also had a common language. And the common language that was spoken throughout that period was Greek. It was a trade language. Everybody spoke it. And so the gospel was being prepared to be spread out and spoken throughout the kingdom. Now, the New Testament tells the story about how hope came, not only for the Jews, but for the entire world. Christ's fulfillment of prophecy was anticipated and recognized by many who sought them. So these 400 silent years is this period of here that's in Zechariah that's been spoken of. The assertion, I will use Judah like a bow and Ephraim like the arrows. In Jerusalem, I will use your men to fight the men of Greece. I will use you like a traitor's sword. Now, Jesus' mission was to establish a kingdom of peace. That's what his mission is, to set up his kingdom and rule the world. But before he can do that, what must he do? Before you can have peace, what must you do? Now, as human nature, are we all on the same page on everything? No, we have differences of opinion. We, in the democratic country in which we live, we determine who is our Prime Minister. Like him or hate him, he is our leader. And every 4 years, we go and we elect him again or somebody else. And that's the freedom that we have. But in the old days, if they didn't like him, they just killed him, replaced him with a new one. We don't have that. But for Christ to come and set up his kingdom, he must get rid of the enemies and deliver his people. And this is the reference to the bow, the arrow, and the sword, emphasizing that there would be a period of warfare as the nation moves forward towards a time of prosperity and peace. Now in Israel, at this present time, it's anything but peaceful and prosperity. There's warfare involved. And they got a dramatic wake-up this week with the things that have taken place. So the prophecy here has a present, in other words, a near application, but it's also pointing to a future fulfillment. The partial fulfillment of this occurred when Judas Maccabee led a revolt against the Greeks, who, after Alexander died, split the kingdom into 4 regions who were governed by his 4 generals. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to any history book and you can read this for yourself. Now, one of these rulers, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, attempted to get rid of the Jewish religion. He didn't like it, so he wanted to replace it and introduce the Olympian cult of Zeus into the Jewish temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar to honor Zeus. He then desecrated the temple by stuffing pork down the throats of the priests, and he sacrificed a pig on that altar. So you can imagine what sort of reception that's going to get from the Jewish people in their temple. So they were led by Judas Maccabees, revolted in a struggle against these Greeks and defeated Antiochus and his successor with only a handful of men. Now, it's interesting that we have seen again and again in Israel the same thing has happened. In the 1967 war, in 6 short days, Israel's defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. How? How was that possible? And there's only one explanation. God was involved. And like a sword in his hand, he defeated these Gentile nations. This prophecy has a future fulfillment, as this passage goes on to describe a complete victory over pagan world powers. It foreshadows all the world powers who will gather their armies around Jerusalem at Armageddon. And when the Antichrist breaks his covenant and defiles the covenant, God will stir up his people with a holy zeal to stand up against him. At the Battle of Armageddon, we will see world nations descending on Jerusalem to attack this small country, Israel. Now, people have asked about the events that have taken place this week. There are no winners in war. There's lots of tragedy. There are innocent people that do get hurt. And people say, oh, you support Israel. Yes. Do I endorse everything she does? No. I don't. But one thing that people forget is this. As I showed last week, God made an agreement with Abraham. He made a promise. And that promise he will keep to himself. He chose Israel not because she was good, not because she was better than anybody else, but because he placed his hand upon her. Israel didn't choose God. God chose Israel. And they are the apple of his eye. And the scriptures make it possible for us to understand God's got his hand on that nation. Will he discipline them? Yes, he does, and has been. But he's prospering them to a point where he says, you have a bright future, and I will come back, and I will reign, and I will rule, and you will fulfill your original intention, where people will come to you and learn of me. So prophecy is there if you want to follow it. But Israel will not be annihilated or driven out into the sea as her enemies are predicting that it's going to be. In every case, God has got his hand on the faithful remnant, and he will do the same in the future. When he comes back the second time, we're going to find all the nations will be in arraignment against Jerusalem. We see the appearance in verse 14. Then the Lord will appear above them, and his arrows will shoot like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet, and he will march in the storms of the south. This is a graphic presentation of the time of Jacob's trouble, when Jesus Christ will make his appearance on the earth and engage Israel's enemies and defeat them. Now he'll make his appearance known, and there's no misunderstanding about what he's going to do. He will protect his people, and he unleashes his power against the nations who oppress Israel. He will call his people to war with the trumpet. He will lead them to victory over many enemies that will fall on that day. Now this would have triggered in the minds of the people of Zechariah of the previous victory they had over Pharaoh through their history. Now, how did God reveal himself to his people that he was with them? How did they know God was with them? How did he show himself? A pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. There was no mistaking his presence with Israel. And in the last days, it will be no different. God will make his appearance through his Son Jesus Christ. He will be their shield and protection. We have the advocate. The Lord all-powerful will protect them. They will destroy the enemy with slingshots. They will drink and shout like drunks. They will be filled like a bowl used for sprinkling blood at the corners of the altars. Now, why is God's victory decisive against all those who oppose Israel? Why does it happen? Is it because Israel's better than anybody else? And the answer is no. God made a covenant with them, and he will honour his word. They'll have a protected covering over them and around them. The Lord will devour these armies in the same way a lion devours its prey. And the people will trample their enemies under their feet like those who sling stones that have missed their mark. It says the people will be triumphant. They will subdue their enemies in preparation for the Lord setting up his kingdom on the earth. Make no mistake about it. It will be a violent war. It will be repulsive. As we've seen the invasion of Israel this week by Hamas, the slaughter of innocent men, women and children who were sleeping in their beds, simply killed because they happened to be Jews. It doesn't change. In the last days, Israel will see the immense amount of blood that is shed during Armageddon. If you turn to Revelation 14:20, it says, "And the winepress was stomped outside the city. The blood poured out of the winepress up to the height of horses' bridles for a distance of almost 200 miles." That's a future prediction. It hasn't come yet. But that's an awful lot of blood that is shed. Comes up to the horses' bridles. That's an immense tragedy of human life. But the scriptures have predicted it centuries before it happens. And yet, today, we're astounded of some of the things that we see. And I've heard people say, how is it possible in the day and age in which we live for something like this atrocity to take place? Well, it really shows us the depths of the human heart and what it's capable of. It really does. Yeah. And now, as I have thought when I saw what has taken place, it doesn't take long for the media to turn things around. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. Now we see the personal reception in verses 16 and 17. When Jesus came the first time, they rejected him as their promised Messiah. An Amplified Version puts it this way in John 1:11. He came to that which was his own, that which belonged to him, his world, his creation, his possession. And those who are his own people, the Jewish nation, did not receive and welcome him. He came the first time. The world wasn't prepared. And the Jewish people rejected him as the Messiah. Jesus is coming a second time to set up his earthly kingdom and rule over the peoples of the world as their king for 1,000 years and set up his throne in Jerusalem. In Zechariah 12:10 and 11 it says, I'll pour out on David's family and the people in Jerusalem a spirit of kindness and mercy. They will look at me, the one they have stabbed, and they will cry like someone crying over the death of an only child. They will be as sad as someone who has lost a firstborn son. And at that time there'll be much crying in Jerusalem, like the crying for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. There's so much turmoil that's happening in Israel today. And it's always been there, simmering away. It's always been like a powder keg ready to go off and explode. Israel is situated in the Middle East and surrounded by nations who are its enemies. They despise her, they threaten her, challenge to wipe her out without any hesitation. This hatred and persecution is only a glimpse of what is awaiting in the end times. According to Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 21, which I think I've got up. Yep. We read this. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken about by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the roof must not come down to take anything out of his house. The one on the field must not turn back to get his cloak. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing their babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great suffering unlike anything that has happened from the beginning of the world until now or ever will happen. In other words, when Jesus comes, the Jewish people will finally accept him as king. He will rule over them and bring peace to a world, this world, if you like, that is so bent on war and retribution. That's when he comes again. The assistants on that day, the Lord their God will save them as if his people were sheep. Now we see a subtle change taking place in our text. When Jesus comes as the all-conquering warrior, this change now plagues. He comes as a shepherd who will take care of his flock, which now will be the centre focus of a lot of things in these final chapters of Zechariah. He will deliver his people, but it's saying he will lead them, tend them, feed them, and reign over them. Why? Their hearts will be transformed as they embrace him, both as a people and a nation. They will see him for who he is. They will recognize him as the promised Messiah. They will acknowledge him as their king. He will reign over them in Jerusalem as a shepherd and supply everything he has promised them. And the scriptures make it plain, for over 1,000 years the nation of Israel will flourish under his leadership as they enter the kingdom. The affirmation: they will shine in his land like jewels in a crown. They'll be so pretty and beautiful, the young men will grow strong on the grain, and the young women on new wine. All of this happens in the millennial kingdom. We'll have men and women will grow and increase. They will prosper. Instead of living under a cloud of doom and gloom as they once were, the shackles are removed and they'll thrive. This is the result of having a king who will give them permanent peace, prosperity, and a time of plenty. Grain and wine are used to show a sustained period of growth and material blessings that come from under the Lord's hand. They will sparkle as jewels in the Lord's crown. They'll be as a nation, and they'll reach their potential under the Lord's hand. In other words, reach out to be a blessing to the nations around them. She will shine among the nations, unlike her past, where she was held in contempt. That will turn around, and now she'll be a shining light to the nations to lead them to their king. We need to understand the king is coming. He's on his way. This same Jesus who once came in humility is returning in honor and might and in power, and he will come and reign and rule over all the earth. Zechariah 9:10 through 17 is this revelation concerning the end of the age and the restoration of Israel in their homeland. And I just want to make a slight deviation, because people say, well, Pastor, I believe that the church is Israel. I don't believe that there is a thing called a rapture. And I want to put up something here that might help a little bit. There is a difference between the rapture and the second coming. Two different events. A lot of people don't see them as two different events, but the scriptures do make it plain. And I want you to see here the differences. In the rapture is which the church is taken up to heaven as the bride of Christ. Christ comes for his own. In the second coming, Christ comes with his own. Now remember, we have to go up before we can come back again to the earth. Christ appears in the air. Christ comes back to the earth. Christ comes as a loving bridegroom. Christ comes as a vengeful warrior, the King of Kings. In the rapture, only his own see him. When he comes back, every eye shall see him. One will be a time of great joy for believers. The other will be a time of great fear for unbelievers. One is a secret disappearance, because it happens in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. There'll be millions, if not billions, of Christians that are removed from this earth. When he comes back, it will be a public appearance where every eye shall see him. The focus will be on the Lord and his church in the rapture, and the focus is on Israel and his kingdom. Two distinct events, all in the scriptures. And we need to be studying the scriptures and see what saith the word. The second coming of Christ is marked by the destruction of Israel's enemies at the Battle of Armageddon for the inauguration of his kingdom. Now remember this, God is always faithful to his promises. He always delivers. He will protect his people. The question is, are we ready for when he does come? Israel wasn't ready. I don't think Israel is ready today. They're looking for the Messiah, but their confidence is in their own abilities. Their confidence is in their technology and their mighty army. Well, that received a bit of a blow to the ego this week. God will bring them to the point where these things are not what they're to rely on, but they will look to him and he will answer. God has shown his people that if he could take someone like Alexander the Great, a pagan, and use him to punish the nations, he has shown them his faithfulness in his history. He protected them, he defended them during these 400 years between the Old and New Testament. Understand, God always keeps his promises. He says, I will restore you, I will prosper you, I will rule over you. When God says something, he delivers. But this morning I wonder, are you ready if the Lord comes today or tomorrow or next week? How will you know whether you're ready? We can become so comfortable in our everyday life, just going through the normal things of life until something upsets it. You know, our world changes so quickly. What happens in one part of the world does affect us. And our peace and what we thought was going to be normal has been shattered. But it's pointing to this. God is preparing his Son to return, and the time is going to be very soon. And as Christians, are we waiting for the trumpet call? Have we got a passion to tell those who don't know so that they too can be ready? Or have we become so comfortable we don't care? We have adopted we're comfortable in the world. We're happy with where we are with the here and now. We don't want him to come yet because we've got a bucket list